Okay, so we're going to go back. Again, what are we looking at right now in the class is very simple, okay? The first part, and what we'll be discussing for the next 2 days, is exactly how the WTO transforms itself, how it becomes a trade system, and what does it mean to be a trade system, okay? What are the kind of rules, regulations, what is called really the whole structure of WTO and how that operates. And then, of course, we're going to go into slight views of what is happening in certain things that have already happened. Because what we know is that we have moved more and more towards regional trade agreements. And as we look at that, then we see how things should be and how things are. Okay. What's happening after one realizes that, in fact, because they opened the door through a very special regulation, which you forgot during your exam, okay, that's the way that you really go into the RTAs, PTAs, etc. Now, this is going to be important now because of the passing away of Mr. Chavez, but that's exactly the kind of problems that we're facing in the world. As we look at the world, whereas this will give me certainty and rules of the game that everybody should abide by, when I start putting things like this, ALBA, I create special conditions which are completely outside the rules of the game, okay? And because they are creating this type of structures, this structure, which is very different from this one, Mercosur and ALBA are not the same thing. And when you separate that, you see how this will fit within the rules of WTO, whereas this does not. And therefore, if we start having that kind of combinations in the world, we're going to be having trouble in the long run. So where did we stop last time? We were asking ourselves, it was a rhetoric question, we know about this, which is GATT was the initial stage of this combination. GATT is a byproduct of what is happening at the end of the Second World War, okay? It's a byproduct. This is not really what was intended. They really were not intending at the end of the Second World War to create GATT. What they were intending to create was ITO, the International Trade Organization. The whole idea was, just like after the First World War, you had all these attempts to really establish a United Nations system, and it failed. At the end of the Second World War, they were trying to figure out how can we create a world where you will have a completely different set of rules that will provide for the possibility of peace and development. And remember, at that time, reconstruction was a very important word, because you had to reconstruct Europe, which had been practically destroyed, as well as Japan and other parts of the world, okay? So when you look at that, you create these three institutions. The first one, we already talked, is the Bank of Banks, the IMF. The second one is the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which now we know as the World Bank, and through which you have other series of banks which are regional in nature. The Inter-American Development Bank, okay, that's a small version of the World Bank. The Asian Development Bank, a small version of the World Bank. The African Development Bank, small version of the World Bank. But everything are development banks. And if you look at our country, you can see the institutions that were created in a similarity concept of what the World Bank was. Because what you have in Mexico as equivalence is the Banco de Mexico as the central bank, and therefore the equivalent of the IMF in a total worldwide situation. And then you have Nacional Financiera, Banco Nacional de Comercio Exterior, Financiera Rural, all these smaller banks which are development banks, trying to help either specific actions in specific sectors or the overall national development program, okay? So look at that and you can see how this replies. These are just replicas, one from the other, from the other, from the other. What you have now is GATT, which appears, and as this author calls it, GATT was a club, okay? It was really something where, look, I mean, we cannot find the best option, which was ITO, so let's go for a second optimal. The second best is GATT. But GATT becomes really a club. So it starts with the kind of rules that the club will have. It's the rules of us as friends. And what this author says, it became increasingly popular, but it makes very clear this point. But the name of the author of this article is Susan Aronson, which is one of the top economists in this thing. And what she says is, GATT is not a treaty. Okay? You don't have rules the way that you will have rules later on. The United States and other nations joined GATT on its protocol or provisional application. This meant that the provisions of GATT were binding only insofar as they are not inconsistent with the nation's existing legislation. Now, this is very important because the one change that you will see is, whereas GATT simply said, you are not going to be inconsistent with the nation's existing legislation, and so countries like the United States could spur trade liberalization or contravene the rules of GATT when politically or economically necessary. Okay? This creates inconsistency. Because what it does is, you and I have an agreement, we put all these things, but if it is convenient for me to change that, then I can do it. And what I do is I change my legislation, by changing my legislation, that will contravene what I had agreed in GATT. This is a very important factor, what happens between GATT and WTO. Okay? WTO, with the trade dispute settlement, is going to make something very clear, which is, if you guys do not follow the rules, then there is going to be a punishment under the rules. Whereas in GATT, in fact, there were rules, but there were not rules, because I could contravene the rules on my own volition independently, and I will not be subject, basically, to any kind of punishment for the act that I just committed. So from 1948 till 1953, GATT is the thing that really put together the trading system. Now, we saw in the last class a video where the person who was presenting the video was telling you all the rounds of negotiations that happened under GATT. And so you had 7 rounds of negotiation. What is the meaning of each round? The round was, in fact, let's all get together and let's discuss what should be the reductions in tariffs, in quotas, in barriers to trade that we are all willing to accept. And so the rounds of negotiations, as you saw in the last class, became not only more complicated, they became of a lengthy process of negotiation. Meaning by that, whereas before it was very easy and you and I get an agreement and we agreed very quickly and we had 1 year or 2 years negotiation maximum, now we end up with 6, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years at the end in the last round of negotiation, which is called the Uruguay round. There is after that the Tokyo round, but the Uruguay round is really the last round of negotiation that you will have, where you bring down all the tariffs and you start including other things into the negotiating process. Because of that, one of the things that's happening is it becomes more complex, more countries are getting into the negotiation, and I start having more difficulty in reaching a general agreement. Okay? Takes longer because we need to decide what is going to be in, what is going to be out, how it's going to be in. It's not only what is in, but also how. What will be the way that we are going to be reducing tariffs? What is going to be the level of tariffs for 1 year, for the next year? What is the compromise if I'm a developing nation and you're a developed nation? Which one is going to do it faster? What sectors are going to be protected? What sectors are not going to be protected? When you start putting all these things on the table, it becomes more complicated. And as you add more countries at the table, it becomes even more complicated. Okay? So the combination that you see is GATT moving slowly. And then during this period, what GATT did, it sponsored what you saw in the last video, 8 trade rounds of negotiations. And look at what it says here. Member nations were called contracting parties. So we are signing a contract. We are entering into this of free will, and whatever we do, we sign a contract. We agree on things. And they agreed to mutually reduce trade barriers. And then it says, but trade liberalization under the GATT came with costs to some Americans, as important industries in the United States, such as textiles, television, steel, and footwear, suffered from foreign competition, and some workers lost jobs. When you answer a question like free trade or fair trade, okay, you have to be very careful what you're talking about. Free trade in itself is a concept. And what it implies is, if you really go into free trade, everybody's going to be better off. Because theoretically, we saw it in several classes, there is an advantage of doing free trade. Fair trade is a concept that has been utilized lately Because what people say is, when you go into rounds of negotiation, when you start imposing conditions of free trade, meaning as you start going into these rounds of negotiations, there is going to be an imposition from big countries or small countries, or there is going to be an exploitation of people. Yeah, but that's a different story. The reason why there is an exploitation, if there is any, is because, in fact, free trade is not free trade, okay? Because what we are looking at right there is a completely different situation where specific interest groups are taking advantage of rules that allow them to take advantage of those rules, okay? And most of the rules come from national positions. No one forced the government of Mexico or the government of Puebla to provide subsidies and benefits to a company such as Audi to come and establish itself in Puebla. Nobody, okay? It's the free will of the government of Puebla to offer what they offer. Now, you may have questions in your mind like, well, yeah, but I mean, if I am a citizen of Puebla, then I would like to be participating. Ah, well, that's a different context, okay? That's why you are, in theory, in agreement with democracy. Because if you agree with democracy and a democratic process, the government that you have is the government that you elected. Now, is that the government of all the Mexicans, of all the Poblanos? Of course. Was it voted by all the Mexicans and all the Poblanos? Of course not. That's one of the rules of democracy. So there's going to be people who say, well, I was not in agreement because I didn't vote for. That's fine. But that was the process of election. Once the process of election is finished, this is the government that represents all the Poblanos or all the Mexicanos, okay? There is no way that you can say after that, it doesn't represent me, you know? Of course it does represent you, and of course the government has to understand that it represents all the people in that country. If you have a dictatorship, it's not the same thing. Because in a dictatorship, by definition, what you know is that there is a set of combinations, power groups, that define what's going to happen in that country. Do they necessarily represent all the people? No. Okay, so that's a government, and when I have that government and I go into a negotiation with that government, you may say, but that government doesn't represent the people of that country, and therefore what these people are defining and deciding is not fair, is not just. Well, you know, this is a political issue and it's very complicated. What I do is I say, who is my counterpart? And my counterpart is representative of the country with whom I'm dealing. Who's the representative? The government. How was the government elected? Well, if I follow tradition, well, it's not my business, yeah? Or should I intervene in that country and see whether, am I going to kill the president of Venezuela by injecting him drugs? Of course not, okay? So what happens is, in the process of this negotiation, it's clear that you're going to be facing representatives from each one of the different countries with whom you are negotiating, and you deal with them as government of that country. So many people will say, because of that, fair trade is not happening in the world. It's a political concept, okay? It's not an economic concept. Free trade is an economic concept. And there's a theory behind it. We spent a long time discussing why free trade was good. Now you can say, well, yeah, you can also do fair trade. Well, you know, that's a definition of what you feel is fair. And then what you may say is, it's not right to put children to work, because in my standards as a society, that is not allowed. But who knows what the standards, okay? Now, you and I and everybody else come to the conclusion that, look, it makes sense that children should study rather than work, because that's the only way that they're going to be growing up to become better and fuller citizens. So a society that does not allow that to happen is a society that, in my opinion, not only is doing wrong, but in addition is creating conditions for that society to be worse off in the future. You're going to be facing this time and again. It's very complicated. It's what is the belief of a certain country? They have a belief that women should not drive in that society. Is that right or wrong? It's very clear from the standard of us, which are Westerners and are used to other things, that is wrong. Okay? Because what you are doing is you are limiting the possibilities of that person by gender to do things that anybody else can. Anybody else mean the male population. So in our standard of thinking, we have evolved to something where we put all these things together, and for many reasons, we have a conception of how things should be. Okay? But that's our thinking. You know, do you believe in reincarnation? And that's a question, okay? Well, there are societies where they do. They believe that after a cycle, they will reincarnate in a different person. And depending on how you behave during this first cycle in your life, you are going to end up in your second cycle. And so life is going to give you an endless number of opportunities to be good. Because if you really want to reach the final stage and not to be reincarnated anymore, then you have to go through this process of I behave well, and then because I behaved well in my previous life, I'm going to be doing right this. Christians, I'm one of them, believe in a linear way. Okay? You are born and you never die. And you simply go straight in a line. You have a period in this called Earth, and then you keep going on. But that's my belief. Okay? Beliefs are very complicated, okay? Because it's what I believe. I may be convincing, and there is theology, and you can study and do many things, but it's very complicated. But the one thing that is not complicated in economic theory is, if you do free trade, and you take all the assumptions of free trade, then the society is going to be better off in the end. And there is going to be a convergence of salaries. And as you look at the world, you see that it happens. Because China today is facing that problem. And the problem that's facing China is salaries in China are now going up, and as those salaries go up, they are becoming less competitive in terms of an advantage you used to have before that was low wage costs for companies that wanted to install there. So if you look at a period like the one in China, which is more than 20 years now, you can see that things happen the way that the theory said they would. Okay? And so free trade is good. Fair trade is a different concept. So we're going to go back to that because I'm going to review with you your exam, but you have to be careful with these things. GATT provides free trade, but under very narrow assumptions. Okay? Because what it does, it allows to incorporate more countries, do the negotiations, but there are certain things that could happen that will go in counter against the results of free trade. One of those things was the fact that I can't say that any provision of GATT is binding only insofar as they are not inconsistent with the nation's existing legislation. Okay? Now, what's going to happen from this concept is, if it becomes binding, then it means that if I negotiate with you and we agree to something, I have to change my internal legislation to make that internal legislation compatible with the agreement that you and I have. Whereas here, what he's saying in GATT is, that was not necessary. You can do it voluntarily, but not necessarily, because it was compulsory. WTO is going to make it compulsory in many ways, okay? So when I enter into an agreement in WTO, that agreement is one that will prime over all the other legislation that I have in my country. Okay? If I look at all these things, what I know is that GATT was successful, yes, because it went on 8 rounds of negotiations. More and more countries joined the club. I started with a small number of countries at the beginning. In the end, many countries are joining the club. As they join the club, are they joining the club because I am pushing them to join the club? Okay? At least in theory, no. It was a voluntary act. I want to join the club, so I joined the club. I knock at the door, and I ask, can I get into the club? These are the rules of the club. You want to get into the club? These are the rules of the club. As this becomes more and more successful, we start discovering that not only these things tariffs, quotas, barriers to trade, which are very quantitative in nature, are the ones I have to deal with. So I start going into a different spectrum of definitions. And then I discovered that it is also important to discuss investment. It's also important to discuss services. It's also important to discuss property rights. It's also important to discuss environmental legislation or rules. It's important, yes, as I start going into more and more of these things, I start looking at exactly what we said was deeper integration in trade agreements. I have to add more things so that I can be comfortable as an enterprise with those things and as a nation also. As you do that, you jump from this, from GATT into WTO. And when you look at what happens with WTO and how this relationship between developed countries and developing countries, yes?
The agreements, they come together like in the GATT. Like you said, like if a nation wanted to, like the nation could change, right? Like not if
because the biggest problem in GATT was the following. My legislation will be on top of other legislation. So when I agree with you on something, in fact what I'm doing is I'm making a compromise with you that not necessarily will be reflected in my legislation. If that is the case, GATT will allow me, because the dispute settlement system of GATT was not effective, will allow me to say, I tried but I couldn't make it, so tough luck, okay? And then I remain in GATT and nothing happens to me. You will get very upset as the country on the other side, and you will say, well, this is not fair, this is not what we agreed on, you have tricked me, and this is a lie. And I'm going to be presenting a complaint. And I will say, be my guest, because nothing is going to happen. The dispute settlement system of GATT was not effective, okay? So in the end, we started going down in terms of tariffs and everything else, but that was because it was convenient and we could do it. But if I, for any need, let me put you a case that happened in the Mexican situation, okay? In the end of the period of Cedillo, just before, it must have been 1997, 1996, I don't remember exactly, maybe 97. They had a situation where they didn't have enough resources because of a general situation in the world, and so what happened is the tax system of Mexico was not providing enough resources to the government to finance what they wanted to finance and to have a level of deficit of 2% or whatever, okay, of GDP. At the time, the Minister of Finance was Gurria, Jose Angel Gurria, who's now the head of the OECD. And Jose Angel took a decision, and the decision was, because we need more income, more resources for the government, we're going to raise tariffs. And so what they did is they went to WTO and they asked permission to raise tariffs. Now, there are two ways you can do that. One of them is the binding nature of the tariffs that you agree in have extremes. They can go as high as this or as low as that. Well, they will let you go as low as you want, but you cannot go higher than 20. But if I have an agreement with you that I will be binded by 20%, it doesn't mean that I have to keep it at 20%. I can keep it at 18, 15. The only thing that it means is I cannot go above 20. So if I have that margin, what I will be able to do is to say, I need more resources. I'm going to be then increasing the import tariffs for these specific goods to the level of 20. If I do that, I am within the margin that I was allowed to do. If I do that because I have allowed, I simply announce and I tell WTO, temporarily I need to do this because of revenue reasons. I need more revenue, and this is an easy revenue way. It's very easy to tax imports. So I'm going to be increasing tariffs to that level. That in itself, I can do, I will announce, and then they will check whether you are not really creating problems for some of the countries, because you may then need to compensate those countries. We're going to see all these things. But I can go. As I do that, this is the binding tariff that I agreed in the negotiation. My system of tax, my legislation in tax says that tariffs were 18%, I changed it to 20. But let's suppose that I really want to go to 25 because I need more resources. If I need to go all the way to 25, I'm going to be out of the agreement. If I'm out of the agreement, then everybody will come to me and say, tough luck, Charlie, that's not what you should be doing, okay? And therefore, you have to compensate me or I will be imposing retaliatory tariffs. But in the end, there is going to be people demanding you as a country in an international court, which is the dispute settlement court, if you want to call it that way, of WTO. And I will go there and I will say, they are not fulfilling the rules of the game that we have all agreed. At that point, you are in their hands. Whatever decisions WTO make regarding this dispute between my increase in tariffs and other countries saying that you are doing that, will be the final ruling. And then I will be forced to do it. So they come back to me and say, you have to reduce tariffs to 20. And I said, I'm not going to do it. Well, if you don't do it, then there is a punishment. And that implies the other country or the other countries can either take retaliatory measures against you, and they can take them to the level of what is called the compensation. Because what I'm going to be analyzing is, because you raise your import tariffs to 25, my exports into your country were reduced from 25 to 20, okay? That 5 difference, you have to pay me. Now, either you pay me or I will collect by myself. How do I collect? I choose from your exports to my country a set of exports, and I say, these are the exports on which I'm going to be imposing a surcharge because I'm collecting the 5 from these imports into my country. Okay? Those decisions are binding in the sense that the other country cannot say, no, you cannot do that. Because what I'm saying is, because of this dispute, you have now to pay me and compensate me for that difference. And WTO will give you the reason. So your legislation, you change your internal legislation, your tax legislation, you increase import duties. That's part of your own internal legislation. But you cannot do that if you are going against the agreement with WTO. In GATT, you don't have to do that. You will do it. The other guy will say whatever they want. Nothing happened. Okay? So it had to be consistent with your internal legislation. Nowadays, your internal legislation has to be consistent with what you agree. Okay? Now that's a sovereignty issue. I have ceded sovereignty.
As well, or on their...
No, under WTO. On GATT, you didn't have that. Now you have it in WTO.
Officer, I didn't understand when you explained the process when you as a country take the exports.
Yeah, what you do is you go and you say, these are called compensatory measures, okay? And they're very funny. They're nice. Let's suppose that I have, these are exports from, let's say USA, which is easier in the case of Mexico, okay? The Americans are exporting into Mexico, let's say, poultry, okay? So you have all these little chickens, and they kill them all, and they send them to you, and you eat them here. And they send you poultry, and you as a country, Mexico, has an import tariff on poultry of, let's say, 10%, okay? So let's suppose that what they do is they send you X number of chickens or tons or whatever, and the value of that is, in dollars, 500, okay? This is what they are exporting in terms of value to your country. As they come here, you say, well, I impose 10%, so in fact, what I'm doing is the price of this will be affected by the 10% I'm imposing, okay? They say I don't have any problem because that's exactly what I'm sending to you. I'm sending this many tons of poultry products, and the value of that is $500 million, okay? You say, okay, I have $500 million, and then you say all of a sudden, I need to increase tariffs. And I'm going to choose this one because it's a nice element. Whereas before I was collecting 50, yeah, people eat this thing, they love it, so I know they will continue to pay. What I do is I increase tariffs now 20%. Because what this will give me, and depends on the elasticity of things, but anyway, what will that imply is that these guys, because of this 10% increase, are going to be losing, and they're going to be sending 450 now, but I'm going to be collecting 90. So my purpose was to increase my revenues as government, because I needed cash. This is an easy product because everybody loves chicken, okay? And as they send me the chicken, I know there is going to be less of that product coming into my country because of the impact on price. But I'm going to be collecting more because the elasticity, price elasticity of this product is inelastic, less than 1. So what happens then is, I get this, I get my increase. Which was my objective? My objective was not to reduce imports, but to increase my revenues. Okay? I'm not an anti-trade person. It's just that I need more money, and this is an easy way to get the money. What I modify, if you look here, what I modify is my internal legislation. Okay? What I did was my internal legislation, my tax legislation. In my tax legislation, I decided that imports will have not 10%, but 20% tax, which is the tariff. Okay? And so what I'm doing, I am not doing because I want to stop trade. I am doing it because I want to increase revenue. But in so doing, my internal legislation on taxes has created a problem for trade. Because what it did, it affected my agreement to have a 10% tariff, and I went to 20%. As a result of that, I am better off as government in terms of my tax revenue, okay? But the other country is worse off because whereas before they were sending you 500 million, now they are sending you 450 million. This difference of 50 is the damage that you are creating because of the increase in tariff. Okay? But you and I had agreed on the WTO rules that the tariff was 10. So you increase it to 20. As you increase that to 20, you are damaging my industry with 50. So what I'm coming to you, I'm saying, okay, I go to WTO and I say they have to compensate me for this loss because this is a loss of trade for me. And it's an artificial loss. It's not because I lost competitiveness, but because they increase tariffs.
What happened with the price of the product?
Well, in Mexico it will be more expensive. That's the reason why I import less. Okay? What I'm trying to, maybe I'm confusing you more than okay. What I'm trying to say to you is, the change in legislation that I am really performing has nothing to do with trade. Okay? I want to use this example just because of what it means. It has nothing to do with trade. I am a free trader. I love free trade. But I have two alternatives inside my country. Okay? Either I do the easy way, which is I increase import duties, because that's very easy to collect and it's very easy to place. And I know that the elasticity of demand of this product is less than 1, and therefore what I'm going to have is an inelastic demand. There's going to be poultry coming to my country, but yes, because I now put 20%, the price in Mexico of that pound of chicken is going to be increased by whatever impact, okay? All I'm assuming in this exercise is you have a reduction then at the end of this exercise where Whereas before they were exporting $500 million of product, now they're exporting for 50 to Mexico. They meaning the producers in the United States. Okay? So these guys look at this and say, wait a minute, man. I mean, I haven't done nothing. I still have my chickens the same way I did. I give them the same food. I have the same price. I send them the same cost. What happened was that you artificially increased tariffs. That's not allowed under the rules that we have. So I go and I present a complaint at WTO. And what I say is, look, I mean, these guys are affecting trade. And they are doing it outside the rules that we have agreed on. And then I say, yeah, but look, I mean, this is not really a question of trade, okay? I mean, honestly, it has nothing to do with trade. The moment that my conditions come back to normal, I will bring it down again. So for the time being, my purpose is this increase in revenue, which is fiscal in nature. Okay? I didn't do it for trade. I did it for fiscal reasons. And I modify my internal legislation, which is my legislation on tax. It's a fiscal legislation. Yeah, well, you can say whatever you want, but as part of that fiscal legislation, you made a change in something which is very important, and is the import duty on poultry products from the United States. And so I come to WTO and I say to WTO, what they did is, through this mechanism, affect my industry at the tune of $50 million. And therefore, I am going to be disputing that. I am going to go to WTO, and I'm going to be demanding that they come back to 10%. So the guy says, no. My internal legislation doesn't let me do that. And then I say, tough luck. If you're not going to go back to 10%, then I'm going to be demanding compensation for this 50. When I demand compensation, you can either pay me cash, no problem, because I give the cash to my friends. Who are my friends? The poultry production industry. Or, because you don't want to pay me cash, I'm going to select a group of goods. Let's say, just say anything, cars. And what I'm going to be doing is, I'm going to impose a tariff on the imports of cars from Mexico of 1%, enough to get a $50 million revenue, which then I can pass on to the poultry industry. And so I compensate my industry. Okay? Now you can imagine what this means. This means that there is going to be a lot of occasions when industries in many countries are going to say, I'm being affected by that, I'm being affected by that, I'm being affected by that, because it gets very interesting for some industries to say, well, at the end of the day, it's interesting for me to realize that I can get compensation and money from this tariff on another people's product. And so it becomes a complicated business. But the point I was making really is the following. We're going to get into that. But right now the point is, my internal legislation doesn't have priority over the agreement that we have. Okay? Whereas in GATT, it wouldn't happen. Now you can do it unilaterally, okay? You can say, well, I don't care, I'm going to be increasing. Well, that's your business. But really what it means right here is these guys, the United States now, can increase tariffs on those cars without being affected in terms of the legal impediment. So Mexico cannot go to them and say, no, you cannot increase tariffs on cars because we have an agreement with WTO, because what they are going to say, precisely because of that, and because you violated that agreement, I am allowed now, after WTO rules, to impose this with no penalty to me. Because in fact what's happening is I'm simply compensating from the loss that you create to me here. Now this dispute settlement system is very effective now. Because what it does, it creates conditions for people to think twice before getting out of an agreement.
Do they have some specific The compensation.
Not for this, but yes for this.
So how they know that that's what?
That's one of the problems. That's one of the problems. You have to demonstrate and bring all this evidence to the tribunal. It's not a tribunal, it's a settlement commission, and say, here it is, all the evidence of what this action of those guys is causing me. And because I am showing you that, then. So I'm going to let you in some tricks that we used to do, okay? How to get around these things.
How does the WTO decide if there's punishment? And is there a committee or?
Yeah, there is a commission of trade settlement disputes. And so what they do is they get all the information from the two parties, they look at all the evidence, and then they rule. Once they rule, that's it. But the important point here is you cannot then give as an excuse the fact that your internal legislation doesn't allow you to. Okay? Because what they say is, I'm sorry, but this was the agreement.
And how long does it take? Does it take like months or years or?
Depends on the cases. We will see some. Some can take years, some which are very simple, like this one, maybe settle very quickly in months.
In your opinion, do you think they're like effective, or is like?
In my opinion, it is quite effective. It's not totally effective, no, but it's quite effective, yes. Okay? It is much better than GATT, no doubt about it. Which is the very reason why WTO is so strong right now, in my mind, is because they can have this trade dispute settlement system that works. And therefore, that imposes, as they used to say in English, the fear of God in some people, okay? You do that, you give me an excuse which is for a different reason, I still see it as a protectionist move. What they're doing is you're trying to protect your poultry industry. And therefore, because you did that, regardless of what justification you are giving me, you're going to be in trouble. I'm going to go there, I'm going to make the case, and then I'm going to be either asking you to compensate me directly or compensate me indirectly by affecting your imports, your exports into my country. Now, of course, you can imagine this is going to be terrible when you have a country that only exports and doesn't import, because then there is no way to compensate, okay? But what has happened in the past 10 years, basically, if you look at this combination of the average tariffs imposed by developed countries on key products from developing countries and least developed countries, these two separations, okay, is the following. Look at what's happened in terms of the three important goods that basically developing countries export, okay, which is going to be textiles, agricultural goods, and clothing. If you look at that, you see how the rules of the game that have been imposed between developed countries among themselves and this intention to help less developed countries works. Because what you see here is what's happening in terms of agriculture, what's happening in terms of, this is agriculture, what's happening in terms of textiles. This is what happens in terms of clothing. For what countries? For least developed countries. Okay? It's Bangladesh, countries like that. And for countries like us, this is what happens, okay? So what you see is clearly a reduction in the average level of tariffs. And what you can see is that agricultural goods coming from developing countries and less developed countries basically are going to be very favored in terms of the import duties. So again, what is fair trade? Because then you start saying, well, yeah, well, look, I mean, in terms of what they are doing, they are opening the door. Are they really paying the producers, the farmers? Well, there's also a problem of how you manage those things inside the other country. Okay? Chiquita Banana is the one that produces more bananas than anybody else in Honduras. Chiquita Banana is an American corporation. Chiquita Banana, therefore, represents the empire. And as it represents the empire, it will be imposing conditions to the poor people in Honduras. Maybe true, okay? Maybe true. The question is, I'm going to be looking at the rules of the game. I'm going to be imposing this combination. And what you have to be careful as country is that inside your country, there is no exploitation of people. Meaning by that wages will be paid to these people. But look at the United States, okay? We get all these people coming from Mexico and Central America into the American farming system. As they walk there, they have no documents that allows them to really go into what? Into the rules of the game. Because what happened to these people is they're willing to work for less than many other people. But in addition, they have no documents. And because they have no documents, they cannot demand equal treatment. Because if they demand equal treatment, they will go to the police or the court. And as they go there and they ask them, can I see your documents? They will have to say, I have no documents. And because you have no documents, you are an illegal alien in my country, and I'm going to be shipping you back. What is creating the conditions is the fact that these people got there and will find a job because people are willing to provide that job at that price. But the rules and regulations of the American system say that to work in that field, you have to be paid $9 an hour or whatever. If I pay $9 an hour, this doesn't work. Okay? So I'm not going to be producing these things. So I find this person, he comes, and this is a market condition. So if I'm a very cool economist, all I'm saying is, look, these are market conditions. People are willing to go there and work for $6, but the minimum wage is $9, and therefore what you are creating is a restriction, which in fact you should eliminate. There is another restriction that you are creating. You need people in your country, but you don't want to give them the proper papers. As long as you keep these conditions, what you are doing is you are creating the structure for this exploitation to take place. Okay? But then the next question, and I'm going to answer, the next question is, and why do the people come and accept those wages? Because in their countries they have worse situation. So you start then finding a justification, which you can move it any way you wish. Okay? But the real fact is, guys, why don't we put a serious system where we eliminate this concept of the minimum wage so that people can work at the wage they are willing to take, but also where you will provide them with the documents so they won't be exploited. Because right now it's true. Because they have no documents, they are in many ways affected by this situation because they don't have the documents. And then the other side is people who exploit them. Sure. So change me the rules, put them correctly, and then you will see a different story. Which is exactly what President Obama is doing right now, saying, let's regularize these people. If we regularize the people, they're going to be better off than before. And we're going to be better off. You had a question there.
So you think that they're doing this so that they can have low wages?
No, absolutely. If I were them, I would do the same. See?
The political say that, well, politicians say that they don't want them there because they're taking American jobs, which we know is not true. So the real hidden reason is that they want to keep the low wages.
The real hidden reason is there is a market for that, and people take advantage of it. Okay? What I mean by people taking advantage is people who are looking for a job and are willing to take a job for less than the minimum wage that has been established in the United States, take the job. Okay? That implies that one or two things should happen in that economy. Either one, that sector disappears because they are not competitive according to the rules that they have imposed. If I have to pay $9 an hour to produce lettuce, I'm not going to be able to sell it in the supermarkets at the prices that I sell it. Because I compete with countries from all over the world, which will bring me lettuce at a cheaper price than the one that I can produce there given my wage restriction. But my wage restriction is artificial. Okay? And it's artificial because I impose that by legislation, not by market forces. So when I impose that by legislation, the people who are in that sector which have the land which produce that and is plentiful so they can do it, will find people to come and work. But because everything is done under this wrong system of signals and legislation, everything becomes illegal. And that's called the black market. Okay? All over the world there are black markets. But the concept of black market is a market which is outside the law. Okay? But the law is the legislation that you and I decide will be the legislation for the country. As long as I have all these people coming from Mexico and Central America willing to take a job in those conditions, then there is a market for them. And because I want to be in that industry, I hire them. Okay? And I look the other way. Now, the fair people, let me put it that way, will look the other way. Okay? They will not ask you whether you have legal documents or not. So you come to work with me and I say, look, I have a job for this. Are you willing to take it in these conditions? And you say, yes. Fine. I give you the job. Yeah? And you produce. And we are pretty much happy. Okay? And the concept of fairness is very complicated. Okay? So I'm talking just market equilibrium right here. You work. You need a work. Yes. You need a job. I give you the job. I cannot pay more than this. Are you willing to take that? And you say yes. I'll tell you another market which everybody loves in this place. Au pair. Yeah? Have you ever had any friend who goes as au pair to another country? What is it? It's a nanny, yeah? Or a companion, if you wish, for some old lady or man, whatever. And you go there and you work and you get house, this, and certain money, and 1 day a week or whatever. But this is completely outside the normal system. If you were a nanny, you will be paid this many more dollars, or euros or whatever. But you don't mind because you want to go there because you want to take a vacation during summer. In the end, the market works because it matches people who are willing to do the job and are willing to pay. Then I create all these rules and regulations. As I create rules and regulations, I distort the market. As I distort the market, then it's no longer a free competition market. Okay? So it's very complicated when we talk about all these things, because what we are saying is these guys are willing to bring products from outside with a very low tariff. The poorer the country is, the better conditions it gets. Normally, a less developing country will have what kind of activities? It's going to be raw materials, which are not here, okay? Minerals, whatever. It's going to be agricultural products. And if they are moving into the chain of production, it will be textiles and clothing, which require a lot of labor. As you look at that combination, these are the three areas where I can help better through trade those countries. Do I impose tariffs on them? I'm trying to impose as little as possible. And in many cases, it's going to be zero, which implies these products can get into my country free of charge. The reason why this graph is interesting is because what you can see here is what are the levels of average tariffs on products of this for less developing countries and developing countries from the countries which are considered developed, okay? Canada, United States, European Union, etc. And what you see here is these guys are trying to give you those conditions. Does that make it fair trade? Well, that's a different question, okay? But what I'm doing is I'm making it free. I'm trying to be as free as possible for your products. So you can use my market to generate jobs in your country. The poorer you are, the more I'm giving you these conditions. The richer you are, the less I'm giving you those conditions. So that's one question. Then the second question is really that good? This same report, this is a report from UNCTAD, okay? This is, tariff peaks and escalation in high-income organization for economic cooperation in developing countries. So OECD countries. What you can see is the evolution of what is called tariff peaks. Okay? What I'm talking here is, this is the International Trade Center, and what I'm talking here is, what is going to be the tariff peaks that I give you? Okay, so let's go to B. It says proportion of total tariff lines in a country's most favored nation tariff schedule with tariffs above 15%. So when I look at that, these are the OECD countries, okay, providing to the least developing countries. And what they do is they say, well, on all goods, yes. My peak tariffs, the ones that go above and beyond that, the proportion that I have on all goods is 10.4%. Are you following this one, or I'm confusing you? No means no, I'm confusing, or yes? We're doing okay. Well, so all I'm saying is, okay, here you have these rich nations, okay? OECD is the club of rich nations in the world. We're included there. Why? I don't know. But and then you say all goods will have the proportion of total tariff lines in a country's MFN tariff schedule with tariffs above 15%. Remember what MFN is. This is the most favored nation tariff. And what is quite interesting is when I look at how I'm doing that, 10.4% of all goods have tariffs which will go above the MFN by 15%. As time goes by, what I'm looking is this line that brings me to 8.9%. This implies that I'm trying to be better off in terms of trade, because what I do is I use MFN for most of the products, and only in 9% of them I have 15% more than the MFN tariff. This implies if the tariff is 0, only 9% of the goods will have a tariff of 15, okay? Which means it's pretty much free trade. Of course it is not, okay? It will be 100%. But the point really made is they have been reducing in all goods. What's interesting though is, but what about agricultural goods? And if you look at that, and you see the evolution, the interesting part is that they went from 35.4 to 36.5. So agriculture is clearly a sector where we have difference of opinion. Because agriculture is one of the most difficult sectors for everybody in the world. In the United States, they provide subsidies to many of the goods that are produced in the United States. And so they have an advantage, which is, in addition to, I'm giving you subsidies. But that's nothing when you compare it to the subsidies in the European Union. The common agricultural policy in the European Union is very complicated because it gives a lot of benefits to producers of goods. Why? Because they say that la campagne, as the French say, has to be nice and green, yeah? And we like all these little, I don't know, animalitos, running around. So I will justify through many means why I give subsidies. But what is really interesting is, look at the agricultural goods. It's very complicated, okay? But if I go to non-agricultural goods, only 4%, only 2.2%. There's a big difference in the way that we treat agricultural goods and non-agricultural goods, okay? There is always a more protective environment towards agriculture than towards any other kind of goods. If you look at the tariff escalation, which is the percentage point difference between the applied tariffs for finished or fully processed goods and the applied tariffs for raw materials, okay, you can see then in all goods it's very small, but again, when you go to agriculture, you have the escalation of tariffs being very important. And you go to non-agricultural, it's basically nothing. So yes, WTO is working. Yes, we are reducing tariffs. Yes, there is many ways that we can do things that still will be affecting the combination. such as laws requiring gas mileage standards, were found to be de facto trade impediments, that country must take action. The example here is with fiscal. The example there is with environmental issues. So what I'm saying is, look, in order to import a car in my country, you have to have these standards. And those standards are out of whack, okay? All of a sudden you just change it. I'm going to say, no way, you cannot do that. But that's my internal legislation. Tough luck, change your legislation. Okay? And therefore, what we're talking about is, it can either change the law, do nothing, and face retaliation, or compensate the other party for the lost trade if it keeps such a law. But it does not go unpunished. Okay? That's the key element. And so what we're talking about here is, am I facing sovereignty? What do you think?
We are looking.
Because I agree to this, and then all of a sudden the guy comes to me and says, I don't care what you do in your country. This is your problem. Your internal legislation is no business of mine. Your internal legislation is affecting trade, and it's affecting trade in a way that we agreed. And therefore, tough luck, change your law.
You can say that.
Yeah, why not? Change your law. It's wrong.
But you as a country can do this, right? Only because someone else is telling you this.
But who is the someone?
Well, it depends on the country is another. What if bigger than you?
Yeah, but see, the question that you guys will be getting over and over again is, this is how they are affecting our sovereignty. And what I'm trying to tell you is, look, what is the loss of sovereignty here? Because in the first, and once you agreed also to a dispute settlement system, which is the key element of the difference right now. Because what's going to happen to you is, yes, you lost sovereignty because you decided to lose it. You gave it because it was part of the deal to get a better, broader benefit. And once you agree on that, if you want to remain in my club, in WTO, you are going to be then to have one of these three things. Either you change the law, or I'm going to be authorizing the other country to retaliate, and you can do nothing, because they are retaliating to what you did first. Or you pay. So some countries may say, you know what, I'll pay. In fact, it's such a small number that I want to pay it because I want to keep these constituents happy. Fine, pay the other country, because that country has then to compensate the people who lost because of an action which is wrong. It's wrong in international standards, maybe right in national standards. But your legislation, your internal legislation, does not prime over the international agreement that we have. Okay? So these are the questions on what it means. People are going to be saying we are losing sovereignty. People are going to say, how could you allow that they will retaliate freely? Well, they are not retaliating freely. They are retaliating because you started the fight. And the last one is, compensate the country means this. Okay? Let's go to this little video so you can see what it really means.
Look around you. Chances are you are wearing, holding, or looking at something that's been imported. Very likely your genes and the technology inside your phone come from a foreign country. They are imported goods and services. Trade is part of our lives. It's what makes the world go round. But in today's world, trade is becoming more complex as more and more countries join the global economy. Imagine this complex trading network without common rules. It would be like a busy day on the road without traffic lights. That's where the WTO comes in. Created in 1995, it expands on a system for trade among nations, built over 6 decades. But what has the WTO achieved since its creation? The WTO is stability. Its thousands of pages of rules are the traffic signs for exchanges between nations. They help companies operate across borders. Companies know that a country belonging to the WTO will be fair with imports. No big surprises. But where do these rules come from? From our members, the governments that make up the WTO. Together, they negotiate new rules for trade and new space for imported goods and services. Rules are agreed by consensus. You only apply rules once you've agreed upon them with your trading partners. Negotiations sometimes focus on just one sector, and shortly after the WTO's creation, it successfully completed a number of agreements. However, negotiations can also cover a wide variety of different issues. For example, the Doha Development Agenda. Launched in 2001, it seeks to reduce trade barriers and improve rules for trade in goods, services, and more. It also seeks to rebalance the system in favor of developing countries. Reaching an agreement with such wide-ranging implications takes time. In 2008, members got close to a deal in major areas, but there was no consensus on every single topic. So the work continues and the objective remains the same: to update the trading system for the 21st century. It's good to have rules, but if you don't respect them, they're of no use. The WTO helps countries resolve their trade disputes. This helps build a stable trading world. When a country thinks a trading partner is breaking a rule, it can submit a complaint to the dispute system. This WTO innovation has proved very effective. The first step is to talk, and about half the cases are solved out of court. But what if there is no solution? Countries can ask a panel to review their cases and lodge an appeal if they are still not satisfied. Still no resolution? Countries can seek to apply sanctions against those not playing by the rules. Stability. Rules designed by all, applied by all. More and more countries are becoming involved in negotiations or disputes because more and more countries are now part of the global economy. The WTO is about participation, and because decisions are taken by consensus, newcomers to the trading game quickly find their position in the organization. Today, more than 2/3 of all WTO members are developing countries, and more are joining. During the first 15 years of the WTO, 25 countries or territories became members, and about 30 more are preparing to join. From day one, everyone has the same rights: a voice in the consensus, a place at the table, and a stable trading system. That alone doesn't ensure the benefits of trade. A brand new car doesn't take you anywhere if you don't know how to drive or don't have any fuel. For developing countries, problems can be lack of good roads and ports, standards in rich markets, even poor preparation for negotiations. That's why the WTO oversees the Aid for Trade initiative. It means putting aid money from different sources to work for the economy, to improve infrastructure. The WTO coordinates and monitors this work with other international actors. Participation. More members, more voices, moving towards a global and more balanced WTO. With a growing number of participants, transparency becomes vital. At the WTO, it starts with the countries. Each of our members informs their trading partners about any changes in trade policy that may affect them. And every few years, they each answer questions from other countries about their global trade policy. But transparency goes beyond governments. That information is available to everyone: businesses, the civil society, the general public, those that make trade happen, including you. Transparency is crucial in times of crisis. As the recession hit, the WTO examined closely its impact on trade. Good, timely information helped governments to keep protectionism at bay. Transparency. Free and open exchange of information for healthier trade. Some critics of trade and globalization have sought to make WTO activities more accessible. So, the WTO has become more open. Openness means promoting debate, listening, reaching out. The annual public forum is an opportunity for debate with the civil society. Since 2001, the WTO has been inviting critics and supporters alike to organize public discussions about trade. The WTO has also opened up its day-to-day life and invites the public to follow dispute hearings if the countries involved want to take that step. Being more open also means putting trade in context. By cooperating with other institutions, the WTO gains a better understanding of how trade impacts on and benefits other areas. The environment, for example, is now part of negotiations, and the WTO has been active in research on how trade and climate change interact. Being open also means opening one's doors. Once a year, the WTO invites the public to look at the place where their governments negotiate, solve disputes, and share information. Openness, connecting the WTO with the outside world. Negotiating, solving disputes, sharing information, opening doors. Who would think a pair of jeans would require so much work? The world is now more connected. Things change faster. More players, concerns about the environment, development challenges. These factors have an impact on how trade flows. Amidst all that, the WTO represents stability, participation, transparency, and openness in this complex world.
Okay, so what you saw there is exactly the offices of the WTO. If you ever go to Geneva, if you ever work for WTO, that's where you will be working. Okay? It's a nice place, very boring city, but yes. So again, I'm going to synthesize and finish with this the class like last time. What we're talking about and what we're going to be looking at in the next 2-3 classes is very simple. We are going to be talking about the basic structure of WTO. You have an umbrella agreement, which is the agreement that created WTO. And then you have 3 strong sectors where they are working. These are the sectors that so far have become the 3 areas where there are general agreements, okay? Because as you saw, they are also negotiating now other specific agreements. So you have negotiations on environment, you have negotiations in other areas, civil, aircraft, etc. But those are not part of the overall agreements, okay? So you have to join those agreements, and that means that they don't have the same impact in terms of the world trade system. The basic principles are, what am I going to be controlling? Goods, services, intellectual property. Then I have other goods and agreements and annexes, which are the ones that are happening. And then I have market access commitments, which are called the schedules of commitments. And that means they have to, once they have agreed, this is the way I'm going to be reducing my tariffs, they have to fulfill those agreements. Because people don't do always what they say they will do, you have now a dispute settlement system, and you have trade policy reviews to have transparency in what people do and how they do things on trade. Therefore, the functions of the WTO are administering the WTO trade agreements, be a forum for trade negotiations. You saw how they sit. They sit one facing each other, okay? These long lines. Handling trade disputes, monitoring national trade policies, technical assistance and training for developing countries when they need that support, and cooperation with other international organizations. We're going to get into this next class. Okay, let me give you then your exams, which I guess is what really you are concerned about. Se acabó la clase, okay?